Dear friends, I think here in the chair we are not very complete, but we are losing time. I think we are really behind the time. So far, I think we are continuing as it is foreseen in the program. You see, we should start at 1:30 concerning collective rights. But as a chairperson, I'm here and I'm trying to continue. Starting with the question of collective rights, this is a very difficult question because concerning human rights, there are only individual rights fixed. I think there are no international regulations on this subject. I think a little bit it is existing concerning minorities, national minorities, concerning language, minority rights for them and so on and so on, but for sure not too much and extremely difficult. I think also bringing it to the court, for example, to the European Court, is not an easy job here. So far, it's very interesting that we are trying it, especially concerning groups where the feeling, here we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and so on, I think, which is still in development concerning acceptance. And it is even more difficult in parts of Europe and the world where it's not so usual. I think we have some countries within the European Union dealing with this and others being totally against within the members of the European Union. I'm not looking further one here. But let's try it. It's an interesting discussion. Chiara Sigele, you are here. Oh, welcome here, beg your pardon. Is Sigele the right pronunciation?
Sigele, almost right.
Sigele.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm working for Osservatorio Balcani Caucaso Transeuropa, which is a think tank and online media based in Italy and reporting about Southeastern European countries, mostly, in a with a transnational approach. So I was asked, I introduced myself this way because I think I'm talking about how to cover human rights issues and specifically in the case of LGBT issues. And I feel we are in a slightly advantaged position in comparison with other media when tasked with this duty, because we are both a think tank and online media, and this helps a lot when you are asked to cover issues that require some expertise. So having researchers in-house is something that makes a difference. And also the fact that we can afford publishing and working on slow journalism, which is another, I think, privilege, because you're not too much influenced by the current affairs media agenda, so can you choose the topic you want to cover, and also you're not so much or totally influenced by the daily agenda and the speed that this daily agenda demands from journalists. The issue, how do media cover minorities and minority rights, and not just minorities, actually, it's really relevant. I just want to mention here that, for instance, the Media Pluralism Monitor, which is a tool that monitors pluralism in EU countries, it also, through a holistic approach, it also measures the dimension called social inclusiveness, which examines which access to media minorities have. And it measures this because it considers it's a core element of media pluralism. And then the results here within the European Union shows that we are having problems. Within this area, just 2/3 of EU countries are in medium risk of being not plural. 3 countries, Greece, Latvia, and Turkey, scores a high risk of not being giving any access to minorities to media, and only 6 countries show a low risk, which is Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK. By the way, I want to say that none of these countries scored low risk on the representation of women, which is not really a minority, but it's relevant when we talk about gender issues in the media. I want to give another example why I think this issue is very relevant, and I was inspired by all the talk we had in the last years in Italy regarding violence against women, which is, again, a pan-European and a global issue. This week, last week, on the recurrence of the World Day against violence against women and girls, we had this interesting initiative by journalists themselves called the Manifesto of Venice for Gender Equality and Correct Information, where journalists themselves committed to better coverage of these issues, and they outlined some key points which are relevant also when we talk about LGBT issues in the media. And I want just to mention some of those points. So it's very important to use an appropriate language and highlighting positive stories about women that had the courage to escape violence, but also about, for instance, LGBT activists working for their own community, framing the story, avoiding images or symbols that are stereotypical, and always begin reports from the perspective of the victim, which is relevant in the case of violence against women, but I would generalize this saying always beginning reports about posing question and giving voice to representative of the communities whose rights we are covering. Of course, I was also interested in the question, how do we achieve a better coverage of human rights? I think it has twofold dimension. On one hand, how do we better cover this topic? So we approach this issue from how often do we cover this topic? How do we frame this topic? But also I think it's a little bit more ambitious, and we should move in this, having this perspective in mind. How do we achieve a human rights-centered reporting in general when we cover crime stories or when we cover current affairs, so that we don't only report about these issues, for instance, in the case of LGBT issues, for instance, when we have an LGBT event like the Pride, but so that we have more often stories and reporting about these relevant topics also in other part of our agenda. Now, I know that we have very little time also because we are late, but I would like to list some of the challenges that we, Osservatorio, even within our newsroom, which is, as I said before, in a slightly advantaged position, the challenges that we are confronted with covering this, either LGBT issue or women, gender, let's say, in our reporting. First, it challenged our habits, our language habits. This is true for Italian more than for English, because often reporting about women, for instance, having an apical position, it requires to renovate the language that you use to refer to them, and this very often doesn't happen just because of you are not used to it, you don't think about that. So challenging habits is the first step. Challenging our own stereotypes. Of course, journalists and researchers themselves have societal, we are all socialized in we have our own prejudice and stereotypes, let's say, and to challenge these stereotypes, having researchers among collaborators, it helps, because of course these are often complex issues, and so it demands some expertise, knowledge sometimes, so we shouldn't be scared of approaching people which have this expertise knowledge, so researchers or even activists, and as I said before, trying to include voices and representatives of the communities we want to report about in our report. And then another issue is also, how do we avoid to even unwillingly disseminate hate speech, because LGBT issues, even women issues, unfortunately, very often are very polarizing and polarized topics. And I think that as journalists, you should always ask yourself if it's always relevant to quote what this or that politician said publicly when it was hate speech, basically, or when you can avoid to report about that because it would further amplify these hate speech messages. Another challenge, which I see also in our daily practice, I would say, is a challenge reporting about human rights. I think sometimes it challenges the very classical paradigm of journalism, in the sense that we are very much used to conceive the journalistic work as something that has to be neutral, objective, independent. But I think that, and I think that there are good examples also of other way of approaching the profession, so meaning highlighting the, so sometimes neutrality can be a problem, meaning if you give the same balanced space to sides that are, for instance, working to advance an agenda of human rights and LGBT rights, and to people who are very contrary to it or even do hate speech against this. And also this rule of journalism being impartial. I think that if we conceive journalism as a tool to empower democracy, we shouldn't consider, through, of course, informed debate and allowing people to make informed decisions, I think we should look at this role of journalism not just in the sense that when there is an election or when you have to choose your position, you know which politicians to vote for instance, but also that we should try to empower people and communities to fight for their rights and to to be inspired by, for instance, solutions that worked within some communities. And here I refer to interesting ways to present the journalistic profession, like advocacy journalism, as The Guardian was doing, for instance, through a huge information campaign they did about against genital female mutilation. And also, I think it's an interesting perspective, the one which is proposed by the current of the solutions journalism, so not only focus on problems, on challenges, but also trying to tell the readers, shows, solutions that are being tested and that in some contexts worked, so as to empower, really, to give ideas that first you can do something to counter trends and to improve situation, and second, that there are solutions that works and that you can be inspired from. So I think I would stop here and leave the floor for the next.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for this introduction to the whole theme. Quite good. Sarinka, you are the next.
Well, I would like to start with a global picture, although we know it all, that refugee crisis and economic crisis gave a go to all kinds of populisms, nationalisms, even fascism, mostly new country members which used to belong to Eastern Bloc. And what we also saw is that EU does not have an answer. After human rights and some fundamental European values have been seriously endangered in Poland and Hungary, the only thing they can do is to activate Article 4 of Lisbon Treaty. And as we know, this procedure has been started by European Commission, but in the end, it would just be a nice try, since Hungary will vote against it and Poland as well, against the same procedure against Hungary. So there is nothing that actually can be done. Problem is, of course, on the other side of the ocean as well, because Donald Trump is the one who supports, for example, Polish ultra-conservative government, and his attitude to human rights, women's rights, minority rights, black people rights are well known and I think quite dangerous, and I'm afraid that there are politicians in Europe and in Croatia that are following his agenda. So Croatian President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, who is highly positioned official within NATO before becoming the president, is of course following this agenda, pushing Croatia into so-called Visegrad Group. So there is no tool in the hands of European officials to sanction democratic deficit and endanger of human rights in some of the EU member countries, and it's up to the national governments to decide about human rights politics they lead. I think that there are three groups of human rights that I can mention, and I will follow actually what you said. The first one is women's rights, and I'll talk first about that. The other one is LGBT rights, and then national minority rights. And as I said, Croatia is actually going backwards in every sense. These days we were discussing Istanbul Convention. This is probably you know, European Council document, which was ratified by the European Parliament and recommended to be ratified by all the other parliaments in the member countries, and this is a document against violence against women. So it's not going to be ratified in Croatian Parliament soon. There was a great division among European parliamentarians, Croatian Europarliamentarians in Brussels, because they voted differently, and some of them were against it. And there is a problem with Catholic Church and its overall influence in political life of the country. They actually invited Catholic MPs to vote against Istanbul Convention, against home violence, because in their opinion there are some definitions of gender which they do not like, and this is an excuse why we would not adopt and ratify this international document, which is just, you know, trying to protect women's rights against home violence. Of course, there was another process going on. Catholic Church and those military Catholic NGOs are try to forbid women's right on legal abortion. And women's rights, which were already acquired by the generation of my mother 40 years ago, 50 years ago, are being constantly questioned. I have to say that this women's rights scene and NGOs are quite strong and quite visible in Croatia. They have influence to what the media do, so you can hear their voices. But the problem is that, again, we lack political leadership. If you have a woman president who is not against Istanbul Convention, but also not for it, saying we should take parts of Istanbul Convention and implement it into national legislation, I don't know what does that mean, because there is nothing wrong with this document. This document was internationally adopted. And of course, home violence is growing. There were more than 300 women killed by their partners during the last 10 years in Croatia. The latest example is that highly positioned official from the ruling party. He was what you call, Mr. Busek, župan. It's somebody who's heading the county, like a governor. So he was accused for home violence, and his wife finally decided to turn him in and went to the police. The problem is that for that move, she was sharply criticized by her own family, by her own neighbors, by her own children, and the prime minister said, and of course he's still at the same having the same function, so nothing happened to him. He did not resign. He was not forced to resign, and the prime minister said that it was interior question of their own party. So home violence was not enough for someone on such a high position to resign. And that's the problem. If you have such an example with the prime minister and the governor, what can you expect from ordinary people? So this is about human rights. When it comes to LGBT rights, I have to say that legislation which have been adopted during the process of integration of Croatia into the European Union was following the highest European standards. But of course, the reality for those people is very different. I have to say that during the last 10 years, Gay Pride in Zagreb, in capital, became a peaceful festival of diversity. Although there are always lots of police looking after those who are marching, but I would say that during the last 8 years, nothing happened. We did not have any demonstration of violence. But nevertheless, those people are facing discrimination, especially in smaller towns in the country, and this is the reason why they all decide to move either to capital or they decide to leave the country. And according to Croatian piece of legislation which was adopted while Social Democrats were in power and the president I was working for was in power, is that they have this right for so-called registered partnership, which is not marriage, but this is something that gives them some kind of judicial protection if they live in, well, as partners together. But of course there was this great campaign against it, and due to the referendum organized by those pro-life groups, same-sex marriage is not allowed in Croatia, including adoption of children. And what we witness every day is this hypocrisy of politicians who, claim to respect everybody's right for their sexual choice, but actually are promoting something that's very, very rigid and very, very traditional. And going to minority rights, I think that, again, according to legislation, minority rights are well protected in Croatia. They have their own representatives within the Croatian parliament. They have 8 seats guaranteed for all the minorities. And that won't be a problem. The problem is that we have still, and we are discriminating still one particular minority, and this is Serb minority. And we don't have problems with all the other minorities, including Italian. They have their right they're bilingual in the parts of Croatia where there are Italian people of Italian nationality. But when it comes to Serb minority, because of the legacy of homeland, Croatian politics is still denying their right for using their alphabet, Cyrillics. And every day we are going backwards into history, blaming the young generations of Serb nationality for the crimes done by some people 20, 25 years ago. And this is a problem. And this whole idea of reconciliation actually still does not work in many parts of Croatia. So it's easy when it's in big towns and capitals, then you don't care much about somebody's nationality. But when it comes to eastern parts of Croatia, to Vukovar, although this piece of legislation was adopted and they have all rights for example, titles of institutions in both alphabets, in both languages, their right is denied, and I don't think that there is any change in the future. And we can also, this is the result of the politics led by not only Croatian president, but also by Serbian president, because I think that this national division is something that suits them both. So the media are covering this thing in a different way. So you know that there are a few anniversaries from the latest homeland war. And during those days, and this is in August, when we had this operation called Storm, when Croatia was freed, and then we had this sad anniversary of Vukovar. And Vukovar was exposed to genocide. Then all kinds of hate speech starts. I mean, of course, those who committed crimes should be prosecuted and the truth should be told, but I don't think that 25 years after the war, we should blame some young people of wrong nationality in Croatia. So I still think it's a problem, and probably it would remain the problem. And as I mentioned, the Serbian minority has the right for the papers. It's Srpske Novosti, and those papers were burned a few times by right-wing radicals on the main square in Croatia 2 or 3 months ago. And they say it's just their move to show that they dislike the politics led by Serbia, but I think this is a threat to Serbian minority in Croatia.
Thank you very much, Zrinka.
Thank you. I will try to make it short so that nobody falls asleep. Representing the Hungarian minority in Romania, for me the issue of rights of groups is a bit personal too. First of all, because the constitution of my country in the first article is already controversial. The national state is a state in which the composition of the population is ethnically homogeneous. Saying that Romania is a sovereign, independent, unitary, and indivisible national state from the very beginning, it eliminates the minorities as groups from the composition of the population. Americans generalize the meaning of the word. In their view, belonging to a nation can also be on the basis of citizenship without ethnocultural nuances. Thus, virtually the overwhelming majority of the world states are national, even if we could say that the United States, although they are some of the most unequal ethnic and cultural on the earth. So it seems that Romania adopted the American way of looking at the term. In real life, the situation is of course strange. We have a Hungarian political party which in fact is in the parliament since the 90s and was almost constantly in the government for years. Now, in the opposition, they are supporting the government in the parliament. So officially, Hungarians cannot complain. They are represented and their rights supported. But when it comes about hate speech, for example, which became very vocal due to the evolution of the social media, radical voices among Romanians called the ethnic Hungarians to leave Romania and go home in their country, Hungary. This hate speech became a normality even on TV, during talk shows, or on one-man show presented as press reviews by several well-known journalists who are attacking the Hungarian minority as often as possible. We have a recent case which involves mainstream media and social media, both fueled by hate speech. It all started with a provocation organized by a blogger, an anonymous blogger, in a Kaufland supermarket in a city where the majority of the population is Hungarian. Even edited and from the beginning a provocation, the movie pretended to present the fact that a Hungarian seller from Kaufland refused to sell some Romanian cevapcici to a Romanian and to speak Romanian language with him, which became a national debate topic. And soon several radical voices in the online media, even on TV, transformed everything in a hate speech, not a debate over possible problems inside the society that we should solve as a nation. Another reason of concern related to the collective rights in Romania is the one referring to the LGBT community and the so-called traditional family. Romania is generally socially conservative with regard to the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender citizens. Nevertheless, the country has made significant progress in LGBT rights legislation since 2000. In the past 2 decades, it fully decriminalized homosexuality, introduced and enforced wide-range anti-discrimination laws, equalized the age of consent, and introduced laws against homophobic hate crimes. Coaliția pentru Familie, the Coalition for Family, is an association of about 30 Romanian NGOs. It seeks to promote the traditional family, in particular by amending the Constitution of Romania via referendum to define marriage as the union between a man and a woman. It is also involved in the anti-abortion movement. In 2006, this NGO gathered 3 million signatures in favor of replacing spouses with a man and a woman in Article 48 of the Romanian Constitution. Immediately after the 3 million signatures were submitted to the Romanian Parliament, an open letter was published in the support of LGBT community, signed by 1,000 public figures, including film producers, pop singers, people from the fashion industry, artists, intellectuals. The letter of support soon became an online petition and raised over 10,000 more signatures. The Romanian Orthodox Church also announced its official support for the initiative in mid-January 2016, for the initiative of the Coalition for the Family. In July 2016, the Constitutional Court issued a unanimous ruling that allows the referendum proposal to move forward. In response, LGBT advocacy groups expressed dissatisfaction with the court's decision, claiming that it could lead to a rise in social tensions and hate crimes. On July 20, 2016, right after the Constitutional Court released its decision allowing the initiative to ban gay marriages, in the constitution to move forward, the LGBT community reacted and organized an unauthorized protest in University Square in Bucharest. Under Romanian law, the constitution can be changed after a proposal by the president, the government, a quarter of the members of the parliament of Romania, or at least 500,000 citizens. Parliament must then approve the revision, which must then pass a national-wide referendum. The coalition efforts to amend the constitution have been ongoing since 2013, when Amnesty International helped defeat a similar amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot about the Romanian constitution. That's very interesting. Okay. So we are opening. Sasha?
I would like to protest to Istvan on behalf of my Serbian friends. I never heard that cevapcici are Romanian special. I mean, then you should say like a cevapcici, because we have... No, well, it should be Persian as a matter of fact, but well, you know, I don't know.
Sasha, in the Viennese language, we have another way to name cevapcici. It's called shevararashishi.
That, however, leads me to a more serious topic. The way we are framing the topic of this session is a typical liberal democratic way. Because we are members of the demos, just to continue the thing, things in reality are not as we would like to see them in our agenda. You see, the freedom of, I mean, generally speaking, we live in a post-ideological time, and I'm going to overgeneralize, but generally speaking, leftists are playing with hopes, rightists are playing with fears. Because of the neo-capitalist success, the fears are pushing people to a very group feelings. And those group feelings, since after communism cannot be class feelings, they are ethnic feelings. So when you see the results of this kind of very drastic push in the society, you will see that, for instance, 50% of female voters in the United States voted for Trump. 49% of the members of the trade unions voted for the billionaire Trump. When you confront this kind of thing with our way of framing the thing, we are coming to the point of a problem of mobilization. Talking about LGBT, you cannot mobilize enough power in the society to make a change in the positive course. Why? Because we are talking about small group feelings. I cannot imagine a worker, I mean, I'm now very generalizing, I'm pushing the agenda, so excuse my rough language, but you cannot mobilize something who is out of work from the car factories in I don't know, in any American city, in Detroit, by talking of the gay rights. Or you can just mobilize to an extent, but never enough. So what I'm trying to say, and what I was talking in the previous session, is that we are trying to find a new way how to make liberal consensus, because that's in crisis. Freedom of the press is actually a result of the liberal consensus. It doesn't mean that conservatives are not for that. But as an intellectual, emancipational product, it's coming from those years, from the 50s onwards, which is coupled with the social state, which is coupled with the liberal rights in the society. That's in crisis. That's what's going on in Poland, that's what's going on in Czech Republic, that's what's going on in many places. Luckily, some other processes are also going on contradicting that. So I'm not saying that we've lost the battle in a way. But these are the big issues which are in conflict, and the way we are framing the topics here is not helping to reach actually this kind of a crisis that we are going through. In my opinion, and that's then came to the level of, I'm not going to extend in that level, to the anonymity of internet, which is actually making big groups of haters, which are very basic haters. So they are large groups, they are not minority groups which can unite. There are large groups of haters which then internet is walking up the laws. So, just to end, I mean, if you want to translate that to the political things, that's the crisis of the European idea currently. Because the European idea currently is going through a crisis of talking about values. They're still talking in a liberal way about values, because European Union is a result of a liberal democracy concept. So what I think is that in the next decade, we're going to go through these very tough discussions. Leftists, however you define them, will have to rethink their platforms and to start mobilizing better than rightists. Because, you know, hope is always a weaker feeling than fear. Fear is a very strong basic thing. That's why they're against somebody else who will come from the Arab world and take our land. That's a very basic fear. And to end with this, our problem as journalists is that basically our agenda is much more complicated. You have to explain context. Context is very difficult to be explained in a one screenshot, because people are not interested to read contexts. They're interested to read the title, if there is video, to see it as a viral video in 30 seconds, and that's it. You cannot explain LGBT rights in one screen. And that's our problem as a profession, how we deal with that. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasho. I think it was a very important contribution. But may I raise a question in this context? Okay, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer are minorities, but these are not the only minorities existing. I think being a little bit disabled, I'm a minority. I think how are the others are dealing with this? I'm depending that they are accepting my difficulties. I think maybe it's a very simple and very personal contribution, but in this context, I think, are we able to deal with differences? And I think always raising the question, is it a majority, is also wrong. Because I think also majorities made a lot of faults in history, I think without any doubt. Don't forget that in 1933 there was a majority for the NSDAP. In my country also there happened some majorities which were for sure wrong. And you can extend the examples, I think, endless in this context. And I think to focus where we are in the context of medias, how to create understanding for differentiation. That's one of the difficulties. And there's one tendency by the human being, we always want to be a part of the majority because it makes us safer. I think we are protected by the majority, is a certain feeling. Who is protecting the minority? That's a real problem. Beg your pardon, it was a contribution. We have already, you are starting and afterwards Rinka.
Yugoslavian, you said?
Huh?
Did you say Yugoslavian?
No.
I'm sorry.
No. I did not mention this word.
No. Look, when there was a talk, especially when Chiara at the beginning mentioned minorities and talking about groups, I was thinking about ethnic minorities, and it led me to raise my hand in order to maybe to say that it would be very interesting to join maybe the projects of macro-regional strategies, which are leading us to a kind of more local regional cooperation. And there can be also a cross-border ethnic minorities cooperation in culture and other fields. And so maybe we should really be more active in these macro-regional strategies, either Danube, Adriatic Ionian, Alpine, Baltic, and so we can do something more in order to communicate, and also on the basis of communication maybe get to some activities too.
Srinka.
Well, I was talking about those groups, about women and about LGBT and then ethnic minorities, but I forgot to mention disabled people. And I do think it's a great problem with the media. I will say something, what a Latin say, pro domo suo. So 20 years ago, in 1997, Radio 101 started a radio show for disabled persons, which was anchored and edited by disabled persons. So the guy who could not move, who's very intelligent, he's educated, but he's in a wheelchair, he actually came to me and asked me for some media space, and I said, yes, great, you have your own show. This was 20 years ago. And he invited ministers, he invited all the people responsible for the rights of disabled people, and this show lasted for almost 10 years. 20 years later, there's nothing, not even on public television. And if there is anything, they won't let disabled people do it. Although I don't think that on their behalf, we who have our healthy lives could say anything. They live their problems. They should talk about their problems. And I would also like to mention the discrimination which probably exists in all post-war countries, that there is discrimination between disabled people and disabled people. You have war veterans with all the privileges in the world. If they say that they were injured during the war, they received pensions and everything. And then disabled people who were born disabled, they are supposed to live on 100 euros a month. And they cannot be employed because this is such an incredible rate on unemployment in Croatia that nobody will employ somebody who's disabled. So there is also discrimination within this group, and I don't think that media are following the problems of disabled people in the way that they let them talk about their problems. They don't want expression of that somebody's sorry for them. They just want to be respected, and this is something that media fail to do.
Thank you. No. 1, 2, 3.
I'll be very brief. I'm Francesco Martino from Osservatorio Balcani Caucaso. I wanted just to try to contribute to the discussion, starting from what Mr. Ordanovsky said. I think that at the moment, this distinction between investing in hope and fear is not, I'd say, updated 100%. I mean, my perception is that at the moment, especially when it comes to global phenomena trending like immigration, for example, I think both left and right are currently investing more in fear than in hopes. And I can bring the example of my country, Italy, as strange as it may seem. For example, Berlusconi rising in politics was based on investing in hope, not fear. So I think it's more like nuanced, and one of the reasons why it is difficult, you know, to find a direction. Otherwise, I agree pretty much with your thesis about the crisis of the liberal model that is reflecting itself on the crisis of freedom of the media and of speech as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ottmar?
Ottmar Rodinsky from Austria. I wanted to add to what you said, Mrs. Vrabets, about the Serbian minority. I just came back from Vilnius, where we had a congress of our association only last week, and there we learned that Lithuania denies the Polish minority. They are about 7% of the population, a little bit more than the Russian ones. They deny them the use of 3 letters in the Latin alphabet, which is really crazy. For instance, the W. A W in Polish is rather important, so they are forced to write their names with a W instead of W with a V, and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to mention that that's also inside the European Union, and there are even 2 EU countries, and nobody cares. The Commission doesn't say anything, and it's a basic right. And then I asked the Lithuanian guy, and what about the Russians with their alphabet? They said, no problem with the Russians, they can use everything because they have the Cyrillic alphabet and this is allowed. So they can use whatever letters they want. So that was...
But by the Austrian practice, I think this W problem with the Polish was managed in Austria. Everybody was saying Walesa, and not Wawensa. I think nobody, I think Austrian, in the average knowledge, is staring at you if you are saying Wawensa. I think, whom does he mean? But this may be specific of my country. Beg your pardon? No, I think so. You have been, huh? Okay, you are the next. Beg your pardon.
May I say, I will try to say some words about national minorities. It will be very hard to say something new after Zrinka and Istvan and all of them. But the main problem is, I think, that we are not interesting for the majority. And we are not existing in the majority media. So it's a very big problem. We are existing only when we are a problem. We have a problem with our own media, which is very small because we are minority, and we must be in the right side and the left side and in the middle in the same time, which is impossible because politically it's impossible. So it happens that the minority media belongs to one side. So it's a big problem too. So I think that the media must be more interested in that problem, because we are talking now about media, and the main problem you mentioned in the beginning, the no adopted international regulation document. Every country is regulating that problem his own way, so it's a very big problem too. Thank you.
Thank you. Chiara?
Mr. Ordanovsky intervention let me think about the fact that it's true that if you consider, for instance, gender minorities, it's hard to mobilize larger communities, even if, and I think that here the media has some responsibilities and some space to do something. For instance, we shouldn't frame the coverage of LGBT issues or even of women issues, and women are not a minority, but still we don't have access to the media or fair representation in the media, just as something beneficial to that specific community. We should be the ones highlighting and explaining why it is relevant to the majority of us. And I think that here there is something that can be done and should be done.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Zrinka?
I would just like to add that during those 10 or 15 years, it became very fashionable for politicians in opposition to march in gay pride. So whoever is in opposition, they are in the first rows in gay pride every year to show how incredibly tolerant they are. So this is something that, okay, was acquired during this process of Euro integration, but of course on the other hand, when they come in power, they usually behave in completely different ways. So this is this hypocrisy. Again, there is nothing wrong with legislation. It goes the same for minorities. Legislation is fine. The problem is implementation and the reality.
The implementation and even to live with. I think concerning the opinions which you can listen and given, I think that's quite different. And in general, I think, I don't want to make a conclusion, but in this sense, I think we have to look to internet, because we are getting two different realities. The realities of the public behavior and the reality of the public of the internet. That's a big difference. I think a lot of things are controlled by the common public, what is possible, and here internet is not controlled. Anyway, I think that will create an important question for the media situation, because internet is also part of the media reality. And I think here we have no legislation on this. Okay, if something is offended by fundamental rights and so on, but it's extremely difficult, I think, to make consequences out of this. Only a private remark. Are we finished? I think it. Okay, please.
Ellen, Erhard, and me as seniors here, we should remind the rest of the group that in our time, it was very, very unpopular for youngsters to be gay, if I think back to high school, nobody would dare to declare himself or herself gay. My son is gay, and when he married, 3 members of the government participated in the party. It's a development over 40 years, but we have to admit to the transition societies that it doesn't come easy, it doesn't come overnight, and to have the idea that we can declare it from the EU or from the United Nations is wrong.
I think that's a very important question, looking to the time frame of development, which plays also a very important role. But maybe it can also move to the other direction. I think I'm not quite sure, is it then a stabilized situation, or might come up a move showing in the other direction? That's the question of the next young generation. Okay. Sasho.
A short final remark, because I think that we are coming to the time when the internet will have to be regulated. Yes. And
right.
That is going to mean censorship, I'm sorry to say that, but either that or the democracy is ended in the way we know it. Now, there is a big discussion how and what to regulate, but we are coming to that position where people are understanding that with this kind of out of the hand, very powerful media, it's going to ruin everything. Sorry for the...
Regulation of content or behavioral regulation, structural regulation?
Again, I'm not even pretending to know how it is going to be. I know that simply it's going to be combined content, plus, for instance, age groups, plus, for instance, hours per day, plus, for instance, regional things, and so on and so forth. Everything will be regulated. Content as well. It's going to be a very difficult and very insecure kind of end game. We'll see whether it actually works. But either that or this is going to go in a very wrong direction otherwise. Because the mobilization of a negative side through the internet is going to overlap everything.
Yeah. Ellen, I remember as internet started, everybody explained to me, this is a fulfillment of total democracy. And I think that's already finished, and I think it's going, and there's a lot of question marks in this direction.
It is a very powerful democratic tool. It's the, Alexei Navalny has a channel on YouTube, and that's the only exposure he will ever have. And next year, it may prove to be extremely important. So I think the cyber optimists were absurdly optimistic, but on the other hand, they're not inconsequential.
Ellen, I might remember you concerning democracy in old Athens. They had also a discussion about democracy, and it was not only a positive, it was also a very negative one, mentioning that democracy might move to ochlokratie. I only know the German version. I don't know ochlokratia or whatever it might be. I think that's also the danger. Don't forget this.
Well, I don't forget it, and I think that you can think of cyclical history, and you can think of history that projects through time, historicism. There are all kinds of ways you can do it. But I think that we have to think very carefully if you want to regulate anything, if it's even possible, to make sure that the end point is the greater information for the greater number. And that's what we're talking about.
But Ellen, I think it's coming up another view. I think legislation is one thing. But I think parts of the time of our society I went through, we had some rules which were not written, which were not a law, but I think in the German language it is gehört sich. I think it is usual to behave in this way. And I think this kind of way of regulation is not anymore existing. Yeah. I think unwritten rules which had some effectiveness, and that's not anymore existing. Okay, I think we have
But
to
the
look at the
I will
timetable.
just have to say
Ellen,
one
you are in
thing.
the chair. The next, I'm giving not the word to you.
I'm taking it.
She had, no. That's not democracy. May I mention you?
Don't be a male.
That's primitive, beg your pardon. I think here can be, and you are female. That's it. Okay, milady.
Only one sentence for regulation. For those of us who lived such a long time under regulations during the communism, I think this is a disgusting idea. I believe Sasho or whatever who is speaking about regulation is speaking about self-regulation. This would be somehow would work, I believe, because otherwise, who will regulate this? This is very subjective. So I would vote a hand for self-regulation eventually, but not regulation itself.
Thank you very much. Let's take it as a conclusion because we have to look at the timetable, and I am now shifting to you. Well, now you can speak lengthy.
I will speak only to introduce the next section and to ask if the participants, do you normally, if you'd like to come up here, Alexenia, Mirja, and Mitja and Anna, and Otmar. Maybe you can come up here since you're so... Yeah, you prefer? Okay. Alexenia, would you like to go first? Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I want to apologize to organizers that have not followed their agenda on this issue, because I really don't feel comfortable to talk about this. But I wanted to stress on human right, which nobody touches till now. This is the right to access to information, which is both important for the journalists and for the citizens. Yesterday, during one of the panels, Henrik mentioned that there was a golden age of the journalism, which does not exist anymore, which is true. And I would like to remind that during this golden age of journalism, we were looking for information, although there were not any Freedom of Information Acts. And this is really like a paradox that nowadays, in most of our European or whatever world countries, there are Freedom of Information Acts, but at the same time, the journalists do not look for the information actively. In fact, the thing which surprises me generally is that when I ask my student in one of my homework, the homework which I am giving to them, to go through Bulgarian public records which are freely available on the internet, and they can look for information, they even didn't know that 370 public records exist in Bulgaria. Which surprises me because they are the people, they are young journalists, future journalists, which eventually should execute their right to access to information. But the thing which surprised me most on a personal level, when one early morning 10 years ago, I started to go to the court because I had a court case against the then head of the chief of Bulgarian intelligence for access to information because he had refused this. And my daughter, who was then 14 years old, he told me, "Mom, what? You are going to sue for access to information the director of the intelligence?" And I was really surprised that 14-year-old did not claim, did not think inside in her mind that it is our human right to get this information. And I said, okay, if a daughter of a journalist is so unaware of her human right, what to say about the others? So I think it's really important, and I'll finish with this just because I want to be short. We as journalists need to execute more strongly our human right to look for information, not only in our countries, but also internationally. I myself have sent in the last 15 or plus years more than 700 requests to information related to Bulgaria to American institutions. And it works. And I have published several books based on this, tens of stories based on this, and so, because our own authorities are trying to hide this information. So this is the first point, that we as journalists, we need to look for this, our rights to access to information, not locally, but also globally. And also that we strongly need to educate the citizen and the citizens and the journalists also to execute this right, not only locally, but also globally. And this could happen through education and through our personal, vivid personal examples. That's all.
Thank you. That's an enormously important asset. Thank you. And then we have Mitya.
Well, hello. I'm going to start with a kind of fiction. Last night, I was approached by a robot journalist. And he asked me a few questions, and he was very kind and very polite and so on. And at the end, he asked me, "Are you a journalist too?" I said, "Yes, I am." And then he said, "Well, you see, I'm a journalist, but I am a better journalist than you are, because I'm not burdened by any human rights." What I want to say is, I hope you understood this kind of fiction. Robots are not humans, but they can be journalists. And since we are living in a world of great words of promises, freedom, democracy, freedom of the press, human rights, and so on, I really always ask myself, what are all these words about? How do we implement them? How do we live them? And I remember that there was American journalist Liebling who wrote once, "Freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own it." And but there is another saying that press freedom is, of course, a human right too. But talking about all these great words, I must go back to some 50 years ago, and it's very subjective, very personal, when I was living in the United States, and we were full of words of democracy. It was in the times of Vietnam War. President Johnson was the president at that time. But at the same time, there was a racial segregation. There were black people who were called niggers or Negroes. They didn't have their rights and so on, but it was democracy. What kind of democracy? And so it's really the question of how we really define, how we describe the things that we are calling them with such a glamorous and great words and so on. And how we really believe that we are democratic, that we are full of human rights and so on. And secondly, still being in the 60s, and that's, I'm coming now to the point of this discussion in the panel. When I was a young journalist at that time, so that's 50 years ago, I got some information about, it was in a time when in Slovenia there was a special event every year, so-called peasants' wedding. there were young couples running to be the best peasant wedding couple. And usually behind this idea were some companies or maybe some media too and so on. And I got information that some company was collecting coupons for a certain couple by illegal and by cheating, by taking out the names from phone directories and so on and putting them down and so on, and collecting the coupons for a certain couple. And I said to myself, that's quite a story, you know, and I should really publish it. But then at the same time, I asked myself, what about this couple? They were not engaged in this cheating. And so before I started writing or publishing this story, I went to see the couple, spoke to them, told them what I learned about their competition and so on. They looked at me a little bit surprised, but they just laughed and they said, okay, you can just publish it. You do that. You do your job. And then I republished. It was Millions for Coupons or something like that, the title of the story. And believe me or not, later on, after this couple was married, they invited me to come to their coffee shop because they bought some coffee shop and they treated me with some coffee. So it's a story of how the things can be really delicate in a way, of how you must be aware how much of freedom can you use not in order to violate another person's freedom. And really, it was my first real lecture how to be very careful about that. But, and now I can really go on to this question of freedom of press and freedom of privacy and private persons. Recently in Slovenia, we had a case when there was a video spot of some teacher having a sexual relationship with some colleague. And quite a lot of media picked up the story and published it. Consequence of this was a teacher committed suicide. So another story which should gain our introspection. And there is also another case that but it's more a general thing, that reporting should be without commenting. That's one of the rules of our journalistic profession. And we usually report facts, cite quotations and so on. But what I noticed, especially in recent times, is that journalists are very often, especially on television or radio, using adjectives which are implying a comment. Adjectives which are implying a prejudice. For example, I mean, you are talking about somebody with a name, last name, and so on, but you would say, he is making a shameful, or he is making a shameful amount of money, or something like that, you know. Or he is, I don't know, quite some dirty expressions about a person which has nothing to do with the reporting on facts. But you describe this person and you violate his good name. So, and then of course there is also quite a lot of hate speech which are also published quite without, just in the name of freedom of the press and freedom to be informed. And so we are, by doing this, we are then creating a kind of negative state of mind in public. And it's really very important that we are aware of these facts. And if we are not aware, we should learn and we should be educated about this, how to avoid this kind of negative sides of our profession. I think that quality journalism that we used to talk yesterday about, I think that we could really do something about in a way that, not that we call this pro and this con person about a certain touchy subject, but that we try to write our own story about it. Our own story, which we put the whole topic into a broader social environment, or in the environment of human rights, and so on, so that we can really, and this is then a kind of story which is also a comment. It's not just a report. I don't know how much we really pay attention in our fourth estate to this kind of questions. And we should also, I know that we are trying to do something, but we are not sufficient enough in this. And I think that in Canada we have now journalists for human rights or something like that, who are very active in trying to train journalists, especially how to behave in investigative procedure, and how to also to respect human rights when they are doing this. And I think that these journalists for human rights are operating in about 25 countries in the world, they have educated more than 14,000 journalists and so on. And I think it's good to pay and to try to use their activities also in order to improve our knowledge and our profession. So I think that I've been too long, and so I violate your time, and thank you very much.
And Anna?
Here. So I can start, yeah. So if we are talking about clash of rights, Ukraine is unfortunately the example of clash of rights for last 4 years. It can be explained by our geographical position. As you know, Ukraine is a pretty big country, and in the east of country, people are pro-Russian, mostly pro-Russian. They speak Russian. Sometimes they don't understand Ukrainian language. Ukrainian is only one official language in Ukraine. People from the west of Ukraine sometimes don't understand Russian language, speak only Ukrainian, and pretty pro-European people. We had this situation for all time, for all years. But 4 years ago, when revolution started, this problem, this problem between Ukrainians appeared like it started to be very hard. 4 years ago, I think that everybody knows about it, last revolution started in Ukraine. It was because of our president Yanukovych, then president, didn't sign next document for going to European Union. And young people came to the square, to the main square of Kiev, and started revolution. They were beaten by police, and after that started protests. It became bigger and bigger. At the same as this president Yanukovych, he was from the east of Ukraine. It's pretty specific region. It's industrial. It's a lot of mines there, and mostly people who work for mines live there. They are very pro-Russian, they watch Russian TV, they are part of Russian culture, and Yanukovych and people who managed Ukraine at that time, they were pretty pro-Russian people. It was hard for them to speak Ukrainian. And this conflict, because of this protest, this conflict all this protests started because of this conflict. 4 years ago, we started new TV. It was online TV, Hromadski TV. We tried to make kind of public TV on internet. It was about 10, maybe more journalists with like strong citizen position. And we just started to go to this revolution, to this protest with our smartphones and made the streams from there. And first days, first months, during the streams, we used these words, this is like right citizen, this is not right citizen. I mean, a lot of journalists who worked in that conditions felt like we should protect some part of this revolution. But I think in 1 or 2 months, we realized that we are journalists first. We had a lot of discussion in our editorial between journalists how we should, what words we should use when we cover it. We had 2 camps. It was camps like pro-European camp in downtown of city and small pro-president camp. This pro-president camp was defended by police, and it was impossible to came there by journalists. All my colleagues who came there, they were beaten, their equipment were destroyed by the people. But I was tried several times to came to this camp and talk to that people. It was people from the east of Ukraine. And usually when media, which covered this conflict, like pro-European media, when they showed these people from pro-president camp, they just talked about them, that they're stupid, they are just take money from this protests. But we tried, not a lot of people, not a lot of journalists tried to understand them for what they are there. I was there for hours. Fortunately, I was not beaten. I tried to understand them. I was scared about all words I used because they are from specific region. It was young people who really take money for this protest, but they had their own position, and I was tried to cover their position as journalist. After that, when revolution finished, we went to Crimea. It was in 2 days before annexion of Crimea by Russians. When we came there, we tried to understand people from Crimea, but they really hated us, people from Kiev. When we told them that we are from Kiev, they told us, no, we will speak only with Russian TV. We will not speak with TV from Kiev. And we start to hide who we are because we wanted to take their comments, to take their opinions. And we just, as long as we can, we didn't tell from what TV we are. We are journalists, we are freelancers. Sometimes we didn't take our press cards, we just take our passports because we realized that we can't work as journalists because these people hate us. We tried to get opinions, we try to get their comments. It was pretty hard, but we tried to be journalists in that situation. So we were beaten there in Crimea, and we came to Kiev. In 2 days, Crimea was next. So 4 years ago, this discussion between journalists in Ukraine started. Because of this, we were not ready to war. We were not ready to all these hard things which happened with us. We just worked in country with some problems, but nobody thinks 4 years ago that we will think about every word we use. After war in the East started, a lot of journalists, a lot of reporters came there and cover there, and they used words separatists, terrorists, rebels, and we still have this discussion what word we should use for people from the East who are in the war, because they are protected from Russia. Yeah, we have a lot of proofs that they are protected from Russia, but we need to find like word for explaining it. I understand a lot of journalists from Ukraine, me and my colleagues, my friends were killed in this war, friends who are younger than me. And for sure, I'm citizen, and for sure, I want to use bad words when I'm thinking about the wars, when I'm thinking about Russia. But first, I'm journalist. I should cover it with right words. And we still have this discussion. We have a lot of media, like media events, where we are talking about how to cover war, what words we should use. For me, for my media in Ukraine, it's very good that we cooperate a lot with international media. We made a lot of international product with Americans, with people from Sweden, from Romania, and as we produce international product, we should use right words. I mean, when we are talking about war, when we are talking about soldiers, and we should use right words for because we want that word understand us. We don't want to show that we agree. We don't want to show. We shouldn't show that we are citizens and we agree. We are angry because of it, but and because we cooperate with international media every time when we cover some part, when we cover this clash of rights in Ukraine, we are thinking how we should call it for word, for understanding. And I think not a lot of Ukrainian media cooperate with international media. And every media has its own rules and words, rules how cover this conflict. And we don't have like general things, general for all media, because very complicated situation with media. Media's in Ukraine, sometimes it's owned by businessmen, oligarchs, politicians, and it depends on owners what words they use for naming this conflict. And I think that if Ukrainian media will produce product for international market, they will use right words. I believe in it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Excuse me, it's allergies. And we have Otmar.
Yeah, maybe I will stress on a few personal experiences in the clash of rights in the life of a journalist, and also in the Association of European Journalists, where I am the president right now. May I start with this morning? Might be of interest to you. I couldn't attend the morning session because I was invited by my Bulgarian colleagues to go to the chief office of the police against organized crime here in Bulgaria. And I think it was the first meeting with journalists, and especially with a foreign journalist, this man had. And why we were there, we were asking protection for especially two Bulgarian journalists who ventured to expose mafia people, narco mafia people in the northwest of this country, and these journalists received only 2 weeks ago death threats by this mafia, so we are really worrying that. About the safety of these colleagues, and we don't want to have another Maltese incident where, you know, a few weeks ago this Maltese colleague Daphne Galicia was also an investigative reporter, was killed through a car bomb in Malta. I think the first real in the recent times, the first murder of a journalist in the European Union. 8 years ago in Croatia.
Yes, my internship.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. And you were already in the EU, yes.
Not yet.
Not yet. So EU is correct. But of course, but the reaction of him was quite. He was very outspoken. He says everything is under control, and he was there, and his police men were starting the investigation, but. But when we talked about precautions they made, he was rather vague and said, "Well, it's the task of the official prosecutor if he gives out an arrest warrant of these drug people." Because these colleagues wrote about what they did, especially with an old woman, I don't want to go into details, who came from Colombia to Zurich with a lot of cocaine in the baggage and was caught. And then she told she was more or less forced to do it, blackmailed by this local gang in Bulgaria. So this guy was in a way quite sympathetic in a way and said, we will try and do our best and we know already who these gang people are, but still we wait for decision of the prosecutor to arrest them or not. Second example, a little bit before, a year ago or so, our association was, especially our French section, was starting an initiative against a planned EU directive, so-called Trade Secret Directive, maybe you have heard about it, which would have put all investigative reporters into danger of being criminalized, because this EU directive more or less protected all kind of company information. First, it was more or less thought about it should protect companies, for instance, Coca-Cola for their secret recipe. But then it was, as always, or often in the EU, it was widened and widened and widened, and then it was all about secret information, all kind of information about the company. So if you would have revealed things like the colleague did about the favorite tax provisions in Luxembourg, LuxLeaks, all journalists in the EU would have been criminalized when they would have reported about that. And LuxLeaks, which really revealed the shameful tax regulation in this country, then led to a conviction of the whistleblower. He got a very high fine, at least not arrest, but he got only a few months ago, he got a huge fine. And the French journalist who wrote about it, he was acquitted. Maybe also because of our initiative, because the French section journalists collected a few tens of thousands of signatures against this directive, and finally Commission gave in. And also with the help of a parliament, we managed that this trade secrets directive was then changed so that journalists who write about companies, and especially if they get information from whistleblowers, would not face criminal prosecution, as it was planned by Brussels. And we had now this consortium of investigative reporters. We wouldn't. Also, these colleagues would face criminal procedures when they reported about the Panama Papers and about the LuxLeaks I already mentioned, and now the Paradise Papers. This would no longer be possible without the danger of being being put before jail. By the way, what the Commission always promised, that there will be a special regulation about whistleblowers, still is missing. They did not come forward with any proposal so far. The Commission, so maybe all colleagues present here should put pressure also on the Commission to come forward with that the EU should protect the whistleblowers. With the rights, also in another more personal experience, I was once convicted, not me personally, but according to media law in Austria, it's not the journalist who writes a story, but the magazine which publishes it could then be brought to court. And my magazine was brought to court by a prominent Austrian politician Erhard knows well, because I wrote in a story about a book about the FPÖ, the Freedom Party. I mentioned that Jörg Haider, the late Austrian politician, wrote about. He called concentration camps punishment camps. So I said this is a kind of defanging or belittling, and this word was then led to a criminal procedure, and so my magazine was fined because I wrote that. And then we went until the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, and finally, after a few years, they said, yes, I had the right to call this a kind of defanging. It's an English word, the German word is verharmlosen. So I was right in telling this. So finally, we got our money back, at least, or some parts of it. And so why I'm telling this, you should always take care of national law, and also maybe you can change it also, and then of course EU law, because once a colleague of mine was also almost convicted by a German court because she quoted from the judicial papers in a German corruption case. And in Austria, it is allowed to quote from judicial papers, documents, even during the trial. In Germany, not. And so the German courts grabbed on that and said, you are now, you shouldn't have done that. And also they said, because it's an Austrian magazine, said, well, this Austrian magazine, of course, can be read by anyone in Germany through the internet. So German law applies also for Austrian journalists. So another example of strange, not regulated EU legislation in the media law. Of course, if you harmonize it like they wanted to do it with the trade secret directive, it's also not good, because then all journalists would have been put into the risk. Finally, also maybe personal experience. I was in Turkey this year on a fact-finding mission together with other media freedom watchdogs like Reporter Without Borders, etc., etc. And the situation there, I don't want to talk too long about it, but we met media lawyers and very brave and courageous journalists who still do their job. And most of the journalists there, 160 I think, are presently behind bars in Turkey. What did they do wrong? They just did their jobs. They wrote stories, they wrote commentaries, etc. And as Erdogan lately said, we have in Turkey, there's only 2 journalists are in jail. So what about the others? The others, they are terrorists. So of course, you can be easily turned into a terrorist in Turkey. The problem is that the Turkish judges wanted to examine, and they had to read all the commentaries of the people in jail to find some word, for instance, in favor of Gülen or some word in favor of PKK to kind of to justify that they are behind bars. And they have to wait now in this high-risk prison camp north of Istanbul since months or more than a year now. And only yesterday I got an email from a Turkish colleague about, and I wrote about him because he was even facing capital punishment. He was one of two journalist colleagues who faced capital punishment in Turkey. His name is Murat Aksoy, and he wrote me, and I end in a positive way. He said, "Thank you for helping and supporting me. I'm now released from prison, and I was acquitted." And I still don't know what was my crime that brought me here behind bars for almost a year or so. But apparently it had to do with one remark at the TV debate, yeah? A critical remark about Erdogan, and the other thing was some editorial commentary he wrote. But he said, he's barred, by the way, from going abroad, because I wanted to kind of invite him to come to one of our congresses, or maybe it would be good to invite him here. But he said he's barred from leaving Turkey, and he said he no longer will work as a journalist because it's too risky, and he doesn't want to come back into prison. So thank you for listening to me, and I hope that you, I wanted to tell you a bit personal experience with this clash of rights. Thank you.
Ellen?
Thank you. Omar?
In terms of clash of rights, I would like to raise up very delicate questions. How should we cover war criminals' rights? And I will give you two examples. Approximately 10 days ago, International Criminal Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia, ICT, sentenced General Ratko Mladic to life imprisonment. He was the military leader of Bosnian Serbs during the 19th war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he was sentenced for horrible war crimes, including genocide. During the trial, his lawyers continuously complained about violations of his human rights, poor prison treatment, and requested that he should be transferred to Moscow for medical reasons, since Dutch doctors, according to them, were not treating him well. Hague Tribunal did not grant any of these requests. The question is, if a journalist reports that his human rights are endangered, would that hurt families of Mladic victims, since General Mladic took away many thousand basic human rights, the right to life? And another example, the ruling party in Serbia invited to one of its events a colonel who was convicted of war crimes and who served his sentence. When journalists inquired about it, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, who is the leader of the ruling party, responded that the person in question was a free man and could attend any event and speak at it. The question is, again, did the journalist who questioned the attendance of a convicted war criminals at official events thus violating his human rights? That's my two questions.
Let me ask all of you.
I would just like to add another example of something that just happened in the Hague Tribunal a few hours ago. So yes, it's interesting situation at home, and actually I'm afraid of what I will find there. So to make things short, there was a group of 6 indicted war criminals for the crimes committed by Croatia in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because at one moment, due to the deal between Tudjman and Milosevic, they decided to divide Bosnia and Herzegovina into Serbian and Croatian part. And at one particular short period, but it was a short period, Croatia actually organized death campuses for Muslims, killing the whole villages, raping women, killing kids, etc. There were 6 people indicted, and they spent almost 10 years in the Hague Tribunal. And today, there was a final decision of the court, so they were sentenced to 20, 25 years, 20, 15 years, whatever. So yes, they were proclaimed guilty. One of them, during this speech of the judge, drank poison. So there were helicopters all day long in the Hague Tribunal trying to save his life. And now the reactions, and I'm reading the reactions of Croatian media, is that they are crying over his destiny, over his family, over blah, 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 forgetting the war crimes committed 20 years ago. And now we come to his human rights. And it will be interesting to see the position of Croatian government and the position of the media. Would we again defend our own national politics, although it was wrong, although we were aggressors in a certain period of time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what would happen, and would this guy who is just sentenced as a war criminal be victim in the end? And I think that he would be victim in the eyes of Croatian audience and public, thanks to the media and the way they cover it.
It's difficult to talk about another topic after this, but still, my question was related to what Alexenia said about free access to information. That's a very important right, and I absolutely agree with her. My question is if she's seeing more tension between the right of free access to information and the right to state secret and the right to protection of personal data. Because now, for reasons of security, we see we are gradually deprived from many of our rights, actually.
I don't see any contradiction. In fact, as soon as you are not against the...
Not contradiction. I'm using intentionally the term tension, and I would explain in the next panel why. Because there is not a consolidated approach if there is a clash of human rights. There are many judges in the European Court of Human Rights who believe that there is not a clash because there is not possible to have a clash, but there is a tension between certain human rights.
You're saying from your interviewing that the judges at The Hague do not think that there could possibly be two rights that clash or that go beyond the limits of the other?
I would highly recommend, because I'm really passionate about the topic, so I read a very interesting publication, a very recent one also. It is called Clash of Public Rights, Clash of Human Rights in the European Court of Human Rights. It's done by Sean Smet and Eva Brems. It's quite expensive, 70 pounds actually, and it's quite big. In this publication, there are basically two two schools of thought. One supported by Cariolu, I don't know the judge, but she says that there is appearance of a conflict on an abstract level, but when you go in specifying the circumstances in which the right is violated or not violated, then it turns that there is not a conflict. And there is another school of thought supported by Zucker who claims that there is not a conflict on an abstract level, but there is actually a conflict when you specify the circumstances. So, I mean, apparently there is not a consensus between the judges in the European Court of Human Rights if we talk about clash of human rights, because they, some of them prefer to see really the human rights as absolutely intact, and that we should really find always a balance and reconciliation, so to say, between. They even explain the four axes how this could be achieved: balance versus non-balance, or a compromise, or I mean, they go in depth really in explaining this. Thanks.
But this is valid also not only for Bulgaria, for this court, I think it's valid internationally. I'll give you an example. As I told you, I have sent in the last 15 years more than 700 requests to the American institutions requesting information for Bulgaria under Freedom of Information Act in America. So for one and the same issue, for one and the same topic, I receive completely different answers from CIA, from FBI, from Department of Defense, from Department of State. If it's about a person, or even for events related to Bulgaria from 25 years ago, one of the organizations said, okay, this is a private matter because it is related to third parties. Other absolutely freely, for instance, Department of State Department freely opened all the records related to the transitional period of Bulgaria, including the secret files of the then American ambassador in Bulgaria during the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, they always try to play tricky and to explain why not to give information, but certain institutions are very open. So that's I would say it's subject to this question of who is the officer responsible for that information there. In America or elsewhere in Europe or in Bulgaria, in a privately, yeah. One more point. For instance, I'm not sure that you know about that, but CIA recently, in the recent years, closed the information to foreign journalists only because under a certain, I can send you a copy of their letter to me, only because I'm not American journalist and I don't report for American media. Okay, but it is stupid to close the information only because I'm not American journalist. This is completely different from the practice than 10 years ago, when I started asking for information under the American Freedom of Information Act in 1998. 10 years later, they were completely open. And 10 years later, they started closing the information, and the final letter was that, oh, you're not American journalists, will not give any more this information. And they secretly accepted this provision. I cannot quote exactly it, but I have the letters. And it is really sad because, in my opinion, 17 years ago, when I started sending first Freedom of Information Act requests, this is the most open country, the best country for journalists to get information, to execute it, the right of access to information. So it's really pity that the things are going a little bit down.
Could we return to the question about that you raised? What is the consensus? What do you think about whether whose rights should prevail, or should the convicted war criminal be deprived of rights? altogether.
He just died. This is what I wanted to tell you. It's quite an international scandal going on right now. Yeah, a few minutes ago.
Who died?
Praljak.
I'm
Poisoned
talking
himself.
about Slivančani.
No, I'm talking about Praljak, I'm sorry, but it's the same story.
I was talking about Serbia.
So, now he'll become a saint in Croatia, by the way, and nobody's questioning the responsibility of the Hague Tribunal security measures and who let him get in the poison. So it was happening this morning. So, should his human rights be defended? That would be the question in Croatia.
That's the same. That's the same case like Milosevic, because Milosevic died during the case. Similar, not the same, because Praljak was convicted, but Milosevic wasn't convicted, and now he's hero in Serbia, of course, like this colonel, or Mladic.
If you wanted to investigate or write about a clash of rights or a potential clash of rights, whether it be war criminal and victims or teachers and slander, what kind of data would you look? Would you be interested in things like that? Would you take your time? Would you seek information through the Freedom of Information Act? Or are generally these questions lower on your agenda? Because they take work.
It takes a lot of work, that's true, but it is an active journalism. Otherwise, I'm afraid that the leaks are to make us too lazy. I benefited from some leaks because I was member of the teams working on the Panama Papers and Swiss leaks and so. But in the same time, I see that it is not the only thing the journalists can do, looking for or expecting in their post boxes some leaks. Well, I'm afraid that the young journalists became too lazy, only waiting for leaks. So it's important to promote and to educate them, especially not only our students in the university, for those of us who are like me teaching in the university, but also our colleague journalists, because mid-career journalists, especially in the small local newspapers, I am speaking about Bulgaria, but I'm sure that this is valid for all our countries. Local media, not speaking foreign languages, most of them, I mean, it's the journalists from local media, they're really not aware of the way they can actively seek for information. So it's when I train our mid-career colleagues all over Bulgaria from small local media, they're really, very happy to learn that they have a chance to look for this information. For instance, if a local crook or criminal is arrested somewhere around the world, they're staying and they cannot publish anything. And okay, I said to them, come on guys, send your Freedom of Information Act request to, let's say, Spanish police. Or can we do this? They ask me. Of course you can. You're journalists, and not only journalists, but you're citizens of this country. So, but they're not aware. So I really think it's very important to educate young journalists and mid-career journalists to be active in this. Education has crucial role. Yeah.
So, thank you. And if you have any new obituaries coming, please tell us as they come in.
I think looking to the timetable, there's a 50 minutes break for coffee.
Oh.
Is it okay or? It's okay. Then break.